Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Erasing the Stigma. Today, I'm honored to be here with Miss Winifred A. Winston, who's an author, an advocate, and an enthusiastic speaker, and also the founder and executive director of Dyslexia Advocation Incorporation. So, Miss Winston, would you be able to introduce yourself to the audience and tell them what your incorporation is?
Sure. I'm Winifred A. Winston, and I like to refer to myself as a proud dyslexia mom. I got in this space because my daughter was identified in second grade. She is now a rising eighth grader. Next week, she'll start eighth grade. And an author, I've written books about my experiences. Unchain Me Mama, The Forgiveness Factor, and it's about women and their relationships with moms, right? And you hear a lot of things about like daddy issues. And then the nonprofit Dyslexia Advocation, that came to fruition out of the need to help Black and Brown folks, right? How to help Black and Brown folks access quality, affordable remediation. When I was doing pitch competitions, I would always say in a matter of 3 days, I was told I needed more than $22,000 in order to help my baby learn to read, and I didn't have it, right? And so, yes, that number was 22,000, but there was a lot of information that I did not know, and I did not know how to access the information, and I did not know how to navigate, right? Like how to navigate the special education system, and that brought to light dyslexia advocation. And I told you before we started recording, the word advocation, I made it up, advocacy plus education, because I felt like those were the two things as Black and Brown parents that we needed to do better: educate ourselves, but then also advocate. So that's a little bit about me.
That is amazing. And what you do, the work that you do, is so inspiring, especially because you started this incorporation as a parent. And oftentimes, parents are in the same situation that you were in. They felt out of debt. They don't understand what resources they need to access, and they don't even know where to start. But having to go to an organization that another parent had set up, being in that same situation, is such a great resource to have. So I want to ask you, you were saying that your Dyslexia Advocation Incorporation was set up to provide resources to Black and Brown folks, so minorities. So, what challenges, in your opinion, do minorities with dyslexia face, considering the intersection of race and learning differences?
That's such a loaded question. So we want to provide access, but also the big thing was the cost,
Mhm.
right? To offset the cost of remediation. Now, I worked in education as an administrator in K-12. Then later, let me back up. Most of my professional experience prior to that was in higher education, in career services and student affairs. I earned my master's so I could teach, and I ended up teaching adult learners. Um, Earned my master's in HR, and I worked in recruitment. It's all going to come full circle. And so then I went back down to K-12 as a high school teacher, right? And then my daughter was identified. And I'm like, oh, wow. Like, as soon as she was identified, I could call a principal. I could call an IEP chair. I knew people. Hey, look at my daughter's IEP. Does this make sense? I remember being a teacher and bringing home all the IEPs and calling up a friend saying, hey, like, what does this mean? How do I do these accommodations? Right. So I had a lot of information and a lot of knowledge about K-12, but yet I still did not understand how to navigate for my child. Right. I was an educator. I had been in the classroom. I worked in higher ed. I've seen adults who were illiterate, but I didn't necessarily know they were illiterate, right? They were in college classes with me, and we're going over resumes and LinkedIn profiles. And it kind of all came full circle for me in that I had all of this experience, all of this access, all of this education. Why didn't I know how to advocate for my child, right? So we go back to culturally, we don't talk about learning disabilities or mental health, right?
Mhm.
One experience I had when I was teaching, I'm in the Baltimore City public schools. Most of my students primarily are Black. One summer, I went to teach in a more affluent white area, and I had students who were on IEPs that were raising their hands as an icebreaker to tell me that they took their medicine that morning. And I was like, oh, okay, like this is different for me, right? And this is all before my daughter was identified. And this program This program I was a part of was predominantly white students. I think I had 100 students, and maybe there was 1 or 2 Black students in each session. I had about 25 students in each section, rather. And we did college math, reading, writing. I think it was technology, the arts, and then I was the career development instructor. And every Friday, you know what we did? We went to college campuses through their disability support center.
Wow.
Right? To say, this is how you sign up for services. These are the type of services and accommodations you can get. Accommodations in college is going to look different than high school. And this was for high school juniors and seniors who had learning disabilities. Right? Again, all before my daughter was identified. So when she got identified, I'm like, I don't know how to advocate for her. And a lot of people that look like me aren't in this space navigating the system the same way. Right. So just culturally, we don't talk about learning disabilities. We don't talk about mental health challenges. And then the access, the cost is a barrier. How much it costs to get an attorney. You got to pay that retainer. Some offer a $250 consultation, right? Just to go in and talk for an hour. They're not even giving you enough in that hour for you to really understand, right? Then you have the cost of specialized tutoring. You got to know the difference between, I'm going to call it, for a lack of a better term, a dyslexia therapist versus, well, a dyslexia tutor versus a homework tutor. There's a difference, right? There's just so much involved. And culturally, and in where I'm at, we don't have parents that can take off or that have the flexibility or privilege to attend daytime volunteer meetings, right? A lot of the parents here where I'm at are a product of a failed special education system, right? And then you have the stigma in our community around learning disabilities. Nobody's talking about it. When I'm around white parents, they're talking about it. They're sharing information. Hey, did you go to this clinician? You should try him, or he did very well. Nobody in my community is talking about it. Now, all I do is talk about it, but nobody is saying, yeah, my child is struggling to read. They might have a learning disability. You know, when I even told my daughter's father, I want to get her evaluated, something's not right. First thing he said is, well, she's not dumb. I said, I know she's not. I said, that's why I'm concerned. She's smart as shit, but she's not learning how to read. Right. So there are so many different factors. And oftentimes folks think that they're advocating to the best of their ability, like they're doing a great job, but they're really not, because you have to understand this process. And as Black parents, you don't want to be seen as that angry parent, right? Because we can always be labeled that angry parent. And so you tend to hold back on some of your questions, or some of them do go in there and like, look, this is not going right, or this is not happening, or I'm not seeing this, that, and the third. And they are responding off of emotion. All decisions in the IEP is made off of data. That's a hard pill to swallow. I don't care how much you think your child knows X, Y, and Z, and how you think about your child. All academic decisions are made based on data, right? And so you have a lot of parents, Black parents, who just don't really understand how to navigate the system, or there's a lack of trust, right? The system failed me. I don't trust this system. And then you always get the, you're not reading enough to your child, right? You're not involved enough. Now, I had the privilege of having a job and being high enough up in my career where I could attend meetings. I could attend Zoom meetings. I could leave work early if I needed to, right? And it wasn't that fear or threat of, oh, I'm going to lose my job, right? I had that privilege. I also had the privilege of a very high credit score, being very transparent. So if I couldn't pay out of pocket for that expensive tutoring that was more than $75 a session, I could put it on a credit card.
Yeah.
I had that privilege, right? So there's just multiple layers that come into play and how we interact when we're advocating for ourselves and our children. Then you have that financial burden, that financial cost, and then also those cultural differences within our community, right? That hinder us from accessing information.
That is extremely impactful what you said. I was really touched by the part where you were saying that you never want to be the angry parent, but how could you not be the angry parent? I mean, the whole system, like you just explained, is set up against you. And if you don't have this like golden ticket of privilege, then you're not going to be able to open the door and get these access or these benefits and able to access the help that should be standardized. It shouldn't be something that you have to fight and fight and fight for, like you were describing. And it's so interesting to me because when you were saying that we as a community don't typically talk about learning disabilities or mental health disorders, it's kind of a taboo topic to talk about. If you don't talk about it, we are people who learn by example. You know, all people learn by example. But if you don't talk about it, you don't have that exemplification of what you're supposed to do. How do you not be the angry parent? Well, you don't have someone who's showing you how to come into a conversation calm and composed while asking all of the right questions and not feeling insecure that you're so out of your depths. So, how are you able to do it? And it angers me myself because there is this notion that we are failing in the system. But the truth is, the system is failing us, and the system is failing our kids. And not just kids of a minority, kids who are in a minority are being hit so much harder, in my opinion. But all kids, because we don't have a system that accommodates different mindsets, different ways of thinking, different ways of learning. So if you don't have a person who fits into this cookie cutter mold of what the education system is, then you are going to be someone who is struggling. And you're then going to have a parent who is, like you were saying, the situation that you are in, who's out of their depths, out of their waters. And it's so crazy to me with all of the experience that you had and all of the background that you had that you still felt like you were out of your depths. And when you're talking about parents who don't have the privilege to take off from work, they don't have the privilege to do extensive research, hours and hours on end of research of dyslexia, not because they don't want to, just because they don't have the time or availability to do it. That is so hard to ask them to figure out by themselves without any examples of how to advocate for their child. So, my question to you is how? Like, how, in your opinion, should we advise parents, especially parents who are of a minority, to best advocate for their child? And where do they start to kind of start on the shallow end to get into this pool of water before they jump into the deep end, to understand how to approach dyslexia education, what dyslexia is, and how to go to a school and ask for accommodations?
Sure, sure. For me, um, early in my career, like I said, I worked in student affairs and higher ed. And so I was a professional career consultant. And I was working at HR at the time of my daughter's diagnosis. And I changed careers. And I became director of admissions of a special education school.
Oh,
I
wow.
immediately knew I needed to be amongst different people of a different socioeconomic status, right? I knew immediately because I was volunteering. Actually, I'm a researcher, right? And I'm always trying to figure out information. So I'm like, I have to learn this process. Now, during the IEP meetings, because of the role I had when I worked in K-12, I was in a role where I had to consult and oftentimes have hard conversations with principals, right? For example, I would have to tell a principal that their budget is not approved, or they can't or they cannot hire someone that they wanted to hire, or they had to get rid of someone that they did not want to get rid of. That was my job, very hard job, right? So when I was in these IEP meetings, I wasn't intimidated, right? There was a level of intimidation that did not exist for me because of the role I played. Again, that's another part of my privilege. And in that role, I would have to go into schools and sometimes be the bad guys, right? So I'm reading body language. I can tell when someone's not being truthful, when they're hiding information. I knew this because of my past experience. So when I was in the IEP meetings, I was very firm. I was very nice. You know, I understood how to communicate with them, but I was noticing there's something's not right here. And then I would go to my car and cry. just like any other parent, like, oh, I didn't get the answers I needed. So for me, I started educating myself, and I went to a presentation about the IEP process that an attorney was given, I want to say the Arc of Baltimore. And during that session, a lady said, oh, you ask great questions. Have you ever heard of an organization called Decoding Dyslexia? I said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. And she said, I think you would be good. You should join them. I said, oh, okay. Continued chatting in that meeting and left and could not remember the name, right? I'm ADHD. I could not remember what she had just told me. So I'm at a traffic light and I look in my rearview mirror. I was like, oh, that's the lady that told me about that great organization. I literally got out of my car at a traffic light and was like, hey, it's me. What's that organization you told me about? Hence, she said the name again. And so I started going to the monthly meetings. It was uncomfortable. Sometimes I would be one of two Black parents. At this time, they were talking about legislation. I'd never been to Annapolis to fight for legislation. I didn't understand half of the terms they were using. It was over my head. It was very uncomfortable. But what I always say to parents is get comfortable with the uncomfortable. Right. And so I continued to come to meetings. And one parent says to me, oh, I'm really good at reading IEPs. Winifred, you want to meet and I can go over the IEP with you? I said, yeah, I have an IEP meeting coming up. And I know these goals aren't great, but I don't know how to make them great. I don't know what to say. I don't know what language to use, but they don't make sense. And so I immersed myself in a space where I was often uncomfortable and where I was often the only Black parent. Right. I took that job as director of admissions because I was determined to understand why the only people I see getting help are wealthy white people that don't look like me. Right. I immersed myself in it so much so that I quickly understood there were different lanes in this space. Right. There's special education law. There's learning your child. Right. I had to really learn my child. What does dyslexia and ADHD look like for my child? Right. That's how I learned I was ADHD. Granted, my doctor said she identified me, but I started seeing things in myself, in my daughter, that I'm like, wait a minute, oh wow, that's me, that's her, like, oh, that's how it shows up. Then you have to understand literacy and reading, the components, of reading. It's a lot of information. So where do you fit in while you're trying to advocate for your child? It is overwhelming. Yeah. It is overwhelming. Every parent is not going to be able to go in and do it the way I do. They just are not. But you have to show up and ask questions. Don't be afraid. Another thing in our community, we don't want another label. I already have a Black boy. Now you want to say my Black son is ADHD, right? I already have a Black daughter. So now we got to put a label, a learning disability on my Black daughter. We already have labels. I don't want to add another label, but understanding in K-12, that's the label that's going to help us get the necessary help that we need, right? So I would say start by educating yourself, start by joining advocacy groups. And I can't stress enough, sometimes you may have to invest in an advocate. And when I say that, I mean pay for an advocate. All free services are not equal, just going to be honest. And then also all paid services is not what it should be. There are a lot of people that will take advantage, but show up in spaces where you're uncomfortable, because that's how I learned. I would not have my nonprofit. I also have a podcast that we do. I'm on a lot of different committees. I'm in spaces where sometimes, again, I'm the only one, but it started off with me saying, you know what, I'm going to go back to that meeting. I'm going to write my answers down, and whatever person here that I feel the most comfortable with, I'm going to call them, talk to them on the side and say, could you answer this? Could you explain this to me? I don't really understand what this is. And the work that I do, I always say, I don't talk teacher talk. I'm not going to say all these acronyms and all these big, fancy, jazzy words. That's all great, but I'm going to break it down so a parent can understand, because I know what it means to, and what it feels like to be in that space and not understand. Now, when I worked in K-12, I had the privilege of working with folks that I could say, okay, we just observed that person in the classroom. What was going on there? Explain that to me. And this is knowledge that I had before my daughter was identified, right? So I think the first thing is to get comfortable with the uncomfortable, join support groups, find other people who have children who have learning disabilities and ask questions. I don't expect every parent to dive all in deep because it is a lot. Yeah. But if you invest in an advocate, a good advocate, that advocate can explain the IEP to you. The advocate can answer questions that you have, and they can help you navigate, because you have to get the IEP first, right? They have to be found eligible for an IEP. Then you have to make sure that the IEP is robust and it's prepared in a way that's going to help your child succeed. Then the third piece, which you really can't control, are they implementing? Are they doing those things, right? And it is a lot to it. I was at a parent resource fair, a back to school fair recently, and I remember 3 parents that stuck out to me. They said their children had IEPs, and the first thing I asked, what's the primary diagnosis? And they could not tell me. And I said to them, you are your child's number one advocate. You need to understand what their primary diagnosis is. If you don't know, how can you successfully advocate for them? Now, you can't tell me that these parents did not care. You cannot tell me that they weren't doing the best with the tools that they had because they were looking it up. Oh, no, I can show you right here. They were on it. They knew that they were either, what they told me, one parent said, oh, no, they're in the program. And they told me they can get out of it. Like, no, that's not really how it works. It kind of works that way, but not really. But that's why education is so important. There are a lot of books on dyslexia. There's a lot of books on special education law. One of my favorite websites is understood.org. Yes. Because it's very practical, digestible information, right? So I'm going to say, show up in spaces where you're uncomfortable, get comfortable with the uncomfortable, and then also educate yourself and find support groups and others who are having similar challenges.
One of the things that you said that was really impactful to me was being comfortable with the uncomfortable. And I think that is completely essential for parents in this process, especially African-American parents, parents who are part of a minority, because like you were talking about before, being a part of a minority in our community, we don't talk about dyslexia or learning differences, and it's uncomfortable. Like if you're not used to that situation, it's going to inherently be uncomfortable. But getting comfortable with that is essential because you get to open the door and get into spaces where you have other people that you can talk with, and you kind of can all balance this burden on each other's shoulders. You're not alone in this issue. And once you become comfortable with the uncomfortable and enter into these spaces, you realize that. And while yes, it still might be very overwhelming, it's less overwhelming when you're going through it with others than it would be going through it by yourself. And one thing that I think is very helpful with entering into these communities, or as a starting point, are Facebook groups. They have so many Facebook groups with parents or teachers about dyslexia, about how you help students and your child with dyslexia. And I think that's a perfect place to start off with these conversations. You might want to start off here and go to in-person organizations, places, websites like you were talking about. I personally find audiobooks amazing because you can listen to them on your car ride or while you're doing the dishes, audiobooks about dyslexia. When I was first learning about dyslexia and what it was and understanding it for myself as someone with dyslexia, and as I was building the Coloring Confidence organization, I listened to a ton of audiobooks about dyslexia, and it really made me more confident in understanding what dyslexia was. And even though, like you were saying, in this process for IEP meetings and different sort of spaces that you have to enter that are very uncomfortable, if you're confident in yourself and you're confident in the knowledge that you have obtained from these different resources and these different community events, that makes going into these uncomfortable spaces that much easier. So you could still be the parent who is fighting for your kid in these spaces and feel like you're going to go to the car crying, which is completely okay and understandable. But it gives you that confidence to go in that space. And that's the most important part, just getting through the door. So I am very impacted by what you said of being comfortable with uncomfortable. And I think that is something that all parents should really instill in their mindset.
Yeah, it's important that we also educate ourselves. So I
Yeah,
have a Facebook group as well, Black Parents Winning Over Dyslexia. And oftentimes I'm in other Facebook groups as well. There's a lot of misinformation.
that is true.
And like my Facebook group is Black Parents Winning Over Dyslexia. And I struggled with should I let non-Black parents in, right? And I thought, well, what do I do? Because I want it to be a safe space. I want it to be a space where parents of color can, ask questions and share examples and parenting tips and different things, because culturally we are different. And I thought, there are some allies in the space, right? And when I say allies, I mean true folks who are white that say, I want all kids to learn. I recognize that there is racism. It does exist. And I want to learn. And I've met some of them, right? Some allies in this space. And I've met folks who were not allies in this space, right? And so I said, well, I'm going to let them in because I would not have half the knowledge if it wasn't for people who did not look like me, right? Point blank, period. I would not. Everyone that helped me in the very beginning did not look like me, and the ones who did, we rallied together, right? And we're learning, and we often talk about how we don't have the proper information, right? We'll be paying for a tutor, but not realize that that's a homework tutor and not an interventionist, not a specialized tutor. And we're spending this money. So we think that we're advocating, right? We think that we're doing the best for our child, and we're not, because we're not educated, right? We don't know that although the school is saying SLD, that SLD is dyslexia, right? I kept saying to them, what is that? Say it again. Okay, well, how are we going to teach her how to read? Oh, we're going to call on her first when she's on the carpet. I said, but that's not teaching her how to read. And it wasn't until the very end of the IEP, the psychologist said, oh, well, when students have dyslexia, we normally, I said, oh, she has dyslexia? Well, how do I find out for sure if that's it? And everybody was like I didn't say that. Yeah, you did. And then I said, well, why don't they want to use the word dyslexia? So you have some school districts that don't want to say dyslexia. Oh, we don't diagnose. Okay, you don't diagnose, but you can identify characteristics of.
Yeah.
That's language there. And how did I learn that? Through education, right? Because they don't diagnose, but they can identify characteristics of. Stop it. The IEP, you can identify dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia on the IEP with the IEP template. How do I know? Because I called the state. I called our State Department, MSDE, and I spoke with someone and they told me. So I was very prepared when I went into the IEP meeting, and they said, oh, we can't put dyslexia on the IEP. I said, really? Because I just called MSDE before I came yesterday, and they told me of the 24 districts in Maryland, 23 use their template. And if you don't use their template, then it must have the same items. Come again? Right? And what I saw was that a lot of parents just aren't educated and don't know the way the system works, right? It shouldn't be that hard. And everybody has to fight the system, right? I'm not saying that white parents don't, but they know how to navigate the system a lot better than we do, right? And so we have to understand that it's not enough to just say, oh, okay, my child has this learning disability and now they have an IEP, we good. No, you still got to be in the game, because how do we know that that IEP is robust? I had someone in the school system tell me, oh, that's a great IEP. Oh, she has a great IEP. Had someone else look at it. That IEP is bullshit. That was their exact language to me. That IEP is bullshit. It doesn't say this. It doesn't have this. It doesn't have this. When I looked at that, I didn't know that. No. I didn't know that. I had someone that I trusted who was in education, tell me it was good. Oh, it's good. They're going to do great by her. That's good. Then I had someone else say, no, it's not. And this is what's missing. And this is what it should say. And this is how it should be worded. Right. And that took time. That took a lot of time. So the education is so key. And oftentimes we don't even know that it's not good information. So I always insert myself in other Facebook groups and just try to put a little comment in there like, that's not really true. If you get an ADHD diagnosis first, it is almost impossible and hard to get SLD behind it, because what they'll keep saying is, oh, that child's not paying attention. That's why they're not paying attention. Now they're starting to act out. Oh, if they would just pay attention. Right. So it's so hard to get that SLD when that is the primary issue holding them back academically, when they get that ADHD diagnosis, right? If they get that first. So it is crucial that we just show up when we're not uncomfortable and be okay asking questions. As director of admissions of a special education school, I saw the difference in how the parents who did not look like me responded to me, talked to me. We applied for private schools and we didn't get accepted to one. And I was so apologetic. I was like, oh, okay, thank you. Like, I literally was like, oh, I'm heartbroken. I'm like, oh, I want her in this private dyslexia school. We didn't get in. Another parent would call me as director of admission. I have to break that bad news that their child did not get in. Why not? I want to know why. What did this, that, and the third? And I'm like, I would never act that way, right? I would never come across that way because I can't.
Exactly.
Right? Because I can't. And I thought, saying, wow, there's a big difference here. There's a big difference. And then she wants to speak to the head of the school and he's going to tell her the same thing. But I saw the whole, their privilege allowed them to be able to talk to me that way, to be able to ask those questions and not be deemed an angry parent. Yeah. Right. But I just automatically was like so apologetic, like, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm apologizing because we didn't get in. That's how my tone and energy was. But I learned so much. But the key thing is to educate yourself, ask questions. Yes, join the Facebook groups, but really, again, understand what dyslexia is and what it isn't, because there is so much misinformation. I've had someone tell me, a special educator, I've been a special educator for 30 years and I've never had a dyslexic student. And the first thing out of my mouth was, and you're a part of the problem. Mm-hmm. Like, I had to catch myself, but I was like, what? Or they'll say, oh, somebody told me, oh, your daughter's dyslexic. I'm so sorry. So what are you sorry for? My daughter is brilliant.
Yeah.
And they're like taken aback. And there's just so much misinformation around it. So you've got to educate yourself so then you can start educating other people. And so I started a hashtag on Instagram, hashtag Black and Dyslexic. And I started trying to find Black folk who were dyslexic, right? And so it started with celebrities, athletes. I needed to find more than just Whoopi Goldberg, Magic Johnson, Muhammad Ali. I needed to find more. I found Octavia Spencer. I found Usher Raymond, Kobe Bryant, right? And then I thought, okay, well, everybody can identify with a celebrity. So then I started featuring what I called everyday dyslexics, right? A principal, a firefighter, a police officer who was like the head of the SWAT team, a young man who was in special education, received special education services, advocated for himself, was going to the IEP meetings by himself, ended up graduating high school valedictorian.
Wow.
Yes. So I started featuring folks who were Black, who were sharing their experiences and sharing their challenges, but also their success, right? And then that hashtag turned into a podcast where we have everyday dyslexics. We feature clinicians, folks, speech and language pathologists, right? Literacy specialists, people in this space that we wouldn't normally hear about. Like, I didn't know what a SLP was or how they could help with a language-based learning disability, right? Now I know language-based learning disability, right? An occupational therapist. I didn't know what dysgraphia was. I didn't know any of, like, what? A developmental pediatrician. My daughter just goes to a pediatrician. Now we have a developmental pediatrician that works alongside the pediatrician, right? So we try to have professionals on the podcast, and then we also have a segment called Badass Parents, right? And my co-host and even my board president, they were all like, badass parent. I'm like, yeah, yeah. Nobody was like, what? But that segment was a parent just telling their journey, right?
Wow.
A Black parent telling their journey. And I get so many DMs because, like you said, the parents say, I'm not alone or I'm not the only one. And often what happens is, as the mom, most often it's the mom. It's not always the mom, dads out there, but most often it's the moms advocating. And sometimes they can't talk to their spouse, right? Because the spouse doesn't want to believe it. And 9 times out of 10, because we know this is hereditary, that spouse is neurodivergent himself, but he doesn't want to hear it about his baby. And then other family members are like, oh, you're doing too much. Oh, ain't nothing wrong with that child. You need to discipline them more, make them work harder. And you can't even confide in your own family. And you know that they love you and your child. So then when you go to these support groups or you hear our badass parent segment, you're like, wow, that's exactly what I'm going through. I'm not the only one. Oh my gosh, this story resonates. It's the same thing for me, right? On one side of the spectrum, that's great. But on the other end, it's very sad that it's the same story time and time again.
Yeah.
Right. It's yeah. So put yourself in spaces where you can get information and also get support.
I have two pieces of what you said that are really poignant and I definitely want to touch on. And they're kind of the two segments that you talked about. The first is advocacy, and the second is how we label dyslexia. So I'll start off with the advocacy. What you are saying is such an amazing and important case for why hiring or investing in a dyslexia advocate is so essential, because you might be someone who, like you said, you don't want to be the angry parent. You do not know how to act in a space where you can both balance properly advocating for your child and composing yourself while also dealing with all these emotions of working in a system that's basically fighting against you and creating these barriers that are specifically against you. But having an advocate to tell you this information is right, this information is wrong, like on the IEP, this is what you need on the IEP, this is not a good IEP. You wouldn't know that, and if you find out about it by yourself, maybe it's so emotional that you don't know how to deal with it, and that's completely understandable as a parent. So that
Mhm.
is an extremely important investment to make during this process. And like you have been talking about this entire time, it's privilege, privilege, privilege of breaking down these barriers and accessing help for a child with dyslexia and getting someone to advocate for you. That is a privilege. And in my mind, it's sort of a give and take, and what you are able to do, and what you're able to let go of and not do because you don't have the privilege to. But I think that, like you were saying, a dyslexia advocate, if you have the ability to take that and maybe give up on some other things like a dyslexia tutor for the time being, I think that that is a very, very important starting point because it lays down a strong foundation. And when you have a good foundation, then you can build up from there. And while you are working with someone who's advocating for you, you're also learning and you are in a safe space where you can ask those questions and you don't feel like you have to cower and be quiet because you don't want to have a label, which segues into the second part of what you're saying with these labels, the label of an angry parent or the label of a Black boy with ADHD or a Black girl with dyslexia. These labels are so negative and they are extremely harmful because they make a lot of people scared for advocating for themselves or coming out and saying, hey, like I have dyslexia, I have a learning disability, because it is such a negative thing. But that is something that I'm extremely passionate about, of transforming these labels, not having dyslexia be something that people apologize for having. Someone coming up to your child saying, I'm sorry that your child has dyslexia, that's terrible. I am so passionate about putting forth these amazing aspects of dyslexia first. Like, people with dyslexia are extremely creative, they're extremely visual, that your child's dyslexia can add to his or her brilliance. And so I feel like if you are uncomfortable with having conversations with your spouse, with your community, with your family about the fact that your child has dyslexia and these negative aspects that can come with dyslexia or ADHD, because a lot of people who have dyslexia have ADHD, we should start off these conversations and really break down the barriers by talking about the positive things. Like if your child's an amazing artist, you point out, my child's an amazing artist. Maybe their dyslexia is contributing to the fact that they're an amazing artist because they're such a great visual learner. I think that's a great way to start these conversations. And again, once these conversations are started, the educational aspect gets brought in because you are learning that you're not alone in this space. Like you were saying, once one person shares their story, someone else says, hey, that's my story too. And you're
Mhm.
more willing to help those around you.
You know what though? So that's a very good example. Like, okay, my child is dyslexic and they're a great artist. But as a Black parent, my mom used to always ask, what are you going to major in? And I was fascinated with broadcast journalism,
Mhm.
right? Never worked a day in my life in broadcast journalism. Now I have a podcast. Now I can say, oh, mom, I'm using that mass comm degree. But she would always say, how are you going to take care of yourself? How are you going to take care of yourself? Right. And so you say, like, we know that dyslexics are great artists. They can see patterns. They're very creative. But some parents immediately think if my child can't read, how are they going to get a job that's going to pay them enough to take care of themselves? So they don't even start looking at the positives because the struggle is so hard. My child isn't reading,
Yeah.
right? And we know about the school to prison pipeline. Third grade, from K to 3, you're um, learning to read, and then 4 and up, you're reading to learn, right? We know that the study out of Texas showed that um, what is it, 80% of inmates were illiterate, about 40% have dyslexia, right? So we know that the prisons are filled with Black and brown people. We know that when children aren't reading, they act out. For our Black children, they may end up in the streets, right? Just bad influence, right? Or severely depressed. Then there's the whole substance abuse,
Yeah.
right? The trying to just numb the pain. So sometimes for parents that are in certain environments, the struggle of the child not even being able to read, not being able to potentially get a job is just so much that just compounds the whole. I don't want to talk about it, right? I don't want to acknowledge it because they can't even see the greatness behind all the struggle. And then you're in a school that not able to provide adequate interventions, and you're doing everything that you thought you were supposed to. You're sending them to school every day. You're making sure they go every day. You had them assessed. You had them evaluated. Okay, now they have an IEP. Why is my child still graduating high school on an elementary reading level? Like
Yeah.
they still can't read. And then what happens? Then they're underemployed or unemployed, right? I talk a lot about adults still struggling with reading who were not identified. A lot of parents that come to me, they're like, wow, that's my child. Oh, they're having the same issues that I'm having. Spike Lee is his son. I don't know, one of them are dyslexic. And he was like, what? That's what it's called? Because that's me. Right. So there are a lot of parents that are like, oh, wow, that's me. And then when moms start talking to me, it's like, yeah, he won't apply for this promotion at his job because he lacks confidence. He lacks self-esteem. Right. So a lot of children are struggling so bad that the parents can't even see the positive because there's so much negative and hurt and pain. Like when my daughter told me that she didn't have confidence, right? I'm not confident in my reading. That hurt. I hurt my heart. I'm like, well, what can I do for you? How can I help you? She said, Mommy, you've done enough. She said, you can't do it. I have to do this for myself. I have to figure it out myself. And I'm just like, okay. But as her parent, just to hear her say that, and then a lot of parents talk about how the kid will have stomach aches
Yeah.
every day. Every day they don't want to go to school. Um, They are feel isolated in school, like they're pulled out, or they're put in a corner, or they're just disengaged from the rest of the learning community, and there's so much pain involved that a lot of the parents they don't believe that it's going to get better. They
Mhm.
don't believe it's going to get better. And when they feel like I am doing the best that I can, I'm doing everything they told me to do. And then here I come and I say, oh, you need to invest in an advocate. What? Sometimes, what? And I'm like, you need an advocate. And then we start that process of educating yourself, getting the IEP correct. Now let's get some interventions. Let's get a tutor now, right? Because the advocate is advising this is the best way, because you're fighting for your child, but then you're also working the system. And sometimes that can hurt, and it doesn't make sense. When I went to go see an attorney. And I immediately, when she got identified, I immediately did some research. I immediately started paying for a tutor. Immediately. Let's see, school started August. By September, October, we had a tutor after school. When I went to see the attorney, he was like, you need to stop the tutoring. I was like, what? What do you mean? And he was like, yeah, you need to stop the tutoring. Now, because it was just an hour session, he didn't like fully explain why he was telling me that. I'm just like, but she's her confidence, and I see her trying to read now, and she's sounding those words out. And he was like, my recommendation is that you stop the tutoring and let's look at the data. I wasn't even collecting or getting the data that I should have been getting that is required of the IEP, but I didn't know that I wasn't getting it, right? And I remember leaving there with my little rolly bag just crying, because I was like, why would he say stop the tutoring? Like, I didn't get it. I didn't understand. Now that I'm more educated in the process, I understand why he told me that. We've got to build a case. You've got to work the system, right? If she's getting this tutoring, we can't determine if the school is doing their job, if the IEP is working, or if it's the tutoring working. How do you determine that? Now we know it's the tutoring because I know that one of her teachers called me and was like, what is Logan getting? I see her using the strategies. But in the space of trying to, advocate for my daughter in this IEP, I'm actually helping them, but I know that they're not doing what they should be doing, because in the 4 months that she was in school, it was about 4 months. I'm like, wow, in 2 weeks, this tutoring made that much of a difference, but we didn't see any change in 4 months. In 2 weeks, we see some changes and things like that. So it's just such a complex thing to do when you don't have the proper resources. And here's one: when you don't know what you don't know until after.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you don't know what you don't know until you need to know it. It's one of those things, like, you don't even know what questions you should be asking. Right? And now you've got your family behind you saying, oh, nothing's wrong. Discipline that child more. They need to sit down and pay attention. They need to stop moving around all the time when they're doing their work, right? How many times do we hear that? They need to sit still and be like little soldiers and just pay attention, when we know that they could be focusing like this, right? And so it's so hard to navigate when, I want to say, you feel like you're in the dark,
Yeah.
right? And it's so hard to see those positive signs, because as your child is struggling, you see them crying, you see them not being able to get the sight words, you see them realizing, because I remember 3rd grade, you see them start to realize that they're behind their peers. Like, because children know 3rd grade, 4th grade, they start, and you see this as a parent, and you're watching all of that. And in the background, you're like, I'm doing the best I can with the tools that I have, right? So sometimes it's hard to get in there and say, oh, look on the bright side. Look on the bright side, because they don't see a bright side. And for us, it's harder because, we don't have the luxury of saying, okay, let my child struggle a little and figure it out. Because we're like, no, you got to get your education. You got to be able to take care of yourself. You got to go through this. We don't have the luxury of saying, oh, just, take a break right now until we can kind of figure this out. We don't have that luxury. I don't have a daughter. I have a daughter. I don't have a son. But I know for my parents that have little Black boys, that's the first thing they say. I have a little Black boy. I have a son. He has to do X, Y, and Z. He has to, make good grades. He has to go on to college. You know what I'm saying? Like there's
Yeah.
just that pressure, and we don't have the luxury of watching them kind of flounder through it. We're just like, oh, we have to get the help that we need. And so often, we don't know what that help looks like or how we're going to afford it.
Yeah.
My daughter's tutoring was, one time we paid $55 per session. Another time it was $97 a session.
Wow.
And I'm not talking one time a week. My daughter was going 5 times a week for 2 hours.
Wow.
Yeah. That's when I was like, okay, we need to do something else. Like this is not working. Right. And oh, let me add, because we both worked full time, I could not get her to tutoring every day. So we had to hire and pay someone to pick her up to help us. Okay. And I was willing to risk it all. Let me tell you, I was willing to risk it all. Like, okay, like whatever I need to do, right? Like whatever I need to do. And a lot of folks, again, they don't have the luxury, they don't have the privilege to access some of the things that I was able to access, right? And they're doing the best that they can with the tools that they have.
Yeah. And this building a toolkit, and the idea that parents are willing to do whatever they need to do for their child to help them out. I am thinking that one thing that parents need to do is, while they're building this toolkit for themselves of how can I afford and get support, what support do I need, who can I hire as a dyslexia advocate, at the same time it's a two-folded process where you have to think of what kind of toolkit can I build for my child. And I personally think that this toolkit can start off at stopping that notion of what you were saying before, of when you are supporting your child or complimenting them or cheering them on for what they're good at and how dyslexia can help them, by taking away that part of, oh, but how is my child going to use this to support themselves in the future? Because while
Mm-hmm.
that's a really extremely realistic concern, we need to fix our mindsets and change our mindsets to understand that it doesn't have to stop at being an artist. I mean, 50% of NASA employees are dyslexic. It goes
Yep.
so much beyond just, oh, my child is good at art. Maybe their art, which I personally did in my schooling, helps them with understanding what they're learning. So maybe your child, when they're going on to 4th grade, can't understand or doesn't understand the way that the material is being taught by the teacher, because the teacher is using books and reading, and your child is not one who can understand that themselves, but maybe they can draw out this information, they can paint it out, and they can express themselves doing something that they're confident in while also learning the information. So the process is not only adapting a new mindset of how can I help my child, but it's also changing the mindset of what my child's future can look like and what education should look like in my child's life. And
That
so,
is, yes, I that you hit it right on the head. That is so true. I had the before my daughter, before she was identified, we were at a small private school, small Christian school, and then we went to a public charter. And when we were touring the schools, I knew how my daughter learned, and we ended up at a arts integration project-based learning school. I said it was the best school I could have picked for her because it worked for her learning style, right? They learned about money by, let's say, doing a lemonade stand, and they also incorporated business and entrepreneurship in that, but then also it was all the math, right? And so I remember having a parent tour the school or ask me about the school, and I'm like, oh, they have, I think they called it was some type of play for kindergarten. I'm messing up the term, but I know it was play. And I remember the parents saying, oh, well, I don't want my kid playing. They need to be learning. And I'm thinking in my head, that's how they learn.
exactly.
That's how they learn. Like, what are you talking about? Now, I remember when I was in private school and, they put the red mark underline and hit you on the hand with a ruler. And it was like a little, like mini boot camp, like soldiers or whatever. But, I'm like, that's not how children learn. And again, culturally, right? Again, culturally, we're used to this kind of discipline or this kind of structure when this actually really works.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's just, again, a shift, but that is so, so true. So now I'm telling you that your child's going to learn in this environment that looks totally foreign to you.
Mm.
You trust the process. Trust the process. We're going to air right. Trust the process. We're going to put our hands under here. So when they say a word, I was doing that with my daughter. I found that on YouTube. We were playing Zingo, I think it was. And I would have her air write it, and then I would have her put a hand under there. Like, I was trying it. It wasn't anything like how I learned. I used flashcards. Flashcards absolutely did not work for her. It just did not work for her. And so I had to be open to this new way because it was totally different than how I learned.
Yeah.
But that is so true. So again, like we said in the opening, it's so many different layers, and it's so much education that needs to take place. And like you said, a mind shift, like shifting your mind about how you think about how we acquire knowledge, right? And it does not look the same for everyone. And it absolutely does not look the same for our kiddos who are dyslexic.
No, it doesn't. And the final thing I want to say before we close is that's the important thing, is understanding that it does not look the same for everyone. And that idea that, like you said in the beginning, you want to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. So going into this uncomfortable space where everyone has different journeys, different paths, and you might not see yourself reflected in someone else's journey, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your journey is wrong or the way that you're fighting for your child is wrong. And I would say that just by watching this Erasing the Stigma video series, or opening up your computer and looking up how to help my child with dyslexia, or going to Color and Confidence, that's an amazing stepping stone, a starting place, because you're fighting for your child. You're there for your child. So it's so important to remember throughout this whole process that no matter how overwhelming it gets and how lost you feel, and like you feel like you might be failing your child, you're there for your child. And that's the biggest thing that you can do. And that's the biggest thing that you can provide them. So thank you so much for speaking with me today. I had an absolutely amazing conversation with you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much. And I always tell parents to give themselves grace,
Yeah,
right? To give yourself grace. You don't know what you don't know, and you are doing the best you can with the tools that you have.
exactly. Thank you.